A very good afternoon to everyone. Welcome you to the lecture series 16 of the Department of English, Diamond Harbour Women's University. The department has been organizing this series of lectures with the intent that we reach out to our students, both academically and also, help them uh, perhaps to look at the aspects and perspectives of different texts in multiple ways. So we invite academicians, who are, of course, best in what they do. And of course, it is our pleasure to have today Animesh Bagh of Kekedas College to have with us. So before we begin this series, I would request Dr. Oparajita Hajra, the professor in the department, Dean Faculty of Arts, and now the acting registrar of Diamond Harbour Women's University. Ma'am, it is our pleasure to have you, and if we could have a few words from you.
Thank you very much, Madhumita. It is indeed a very special privilege to keep welcoming erudite personalities to the department, and I would really like to thank and congratulate Madhumita as the head of the department for organizing all this so diligently and consistently. So today we are going to have Professor Animesh Bagh from KK Das College. He's going to talk on the special politics of Sundarbans. And since we hail from the Diamond Harbour Women's University, which is close by this Sundarban, so it is even more relevant for us to talk on this topic and listen to people talking on this topic. So, without further ado, I don't think I should take up screen space anymore. So I'll hand it over to Modumita. But before I do that, I would like to extend my hearty welcome to Professor Bagh to Diamond Harbour Women's University, online though it is, but we are have you here. Thank you very much.
Um, Thank you, ma'am. And it is, of course, always a pleasure to hear from you. And now I would invite my colleague in the department, Dr. Malashri Mandal, to please welcome the speaker and introduce the speaker.
Thank you, Madhumita Di. I welcome Animesh Bagh. Animesh Bagh is an assistant professor in the Department of English, Kekedash College, Kolkata, India. He is presently pursuing PhD at Jadavpur University, West Bengal. He has obtained his MPhil from Vishwabharati Shantiniketan. He is a recipient of UGC Junior Research Fellowship. His article has been published in journals and books including Atlantic, Gangchil, Mizoram Central University Journal of Literature and Culture Studies, Dibrugarh English Studies Journal, Muse India, Yearly Shakespeare, among others. His forthcoming articles will be published from Routledge, Bloomsbury, Palgrave Macmillan, Days, and others. He has presented papers in national and international seminars and conferences such as MISAS, Columbia University, 19th Century Studies Association, Penn State University, Texas State University, University of Sheffield, Turkey Osmaniye University, Turkey, and others. His related domains of specialization are 19th century studies, colonial Bengal, horror studies, and critical theory. So, once again, I welcome Animesh Bagh for this lecture series 16 of Department of English, Diamond Harbour Women's University. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mandal. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Uh, First of all, let me just start my slides.
Do it from the present column, Animesh. I think that would be
Yes,
easy. Yeah.
yes, I'm doing this. Ah, is it visible, right?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Mandal, for such uh, generous introduction. And I would like to extend my gratitude to the Department of English, Diamond Harbour Women's University, uh, Dean Ma'am, Professor Aparajita Hajra, HOD, uh, Dr. Madhumita Majumdar, all the other esteemed faculty members, and of course students. Uh, Before I begin my lecture, just uh, I'd like to start with the first slide, which is actually shows the map of Sundarban. Now, in my lecture, I'll basically talk about the spatial politics of Sundarbans in reference to Amitabh Ghosh's The Hungry Tides. So, before going into the lecture in detail, let me just draw a brief outline of my whole lecture. I'll begin with the spatial dimension of this region first, then how, over the periods, literatures in vernacular as well as Anglophone literature, how this geographical region of Sundarbans has been presented so far, and what is the transformation uh, took place in Amitabh Ghosh's text. And then I'll also talk about a brief idea of this so-called spatial turn, which was developed probably in 1960s. And then I'll talk about the idea of belongingness, particularly with reference to the text The Hungry Tide. Uh, I'll then briefly talk about the idea of language, and finally end with a psychoanalytical interpretation of this uh, space. Now, yeah, yes. Now, the reason behind putting this map in the first slide is to show the geographical location of the place. And we all know that Sundarbans is located in the coastal region of West Bengal, right, in the Bay of Bengal region. And this geographical position can be understood from the perspective of hinterland. So I'll begin my lecture how these two ideas, I mean, at one point, this idea of hinterland and this geographical location, Sundarbans, can be placed together and can be understood together, particularly from the spatial perspective, spatial theoretical perspective. Let me just start with a quote from the text. Ghosh himself says, "This is the time for what can be said. Here is its country, speak and testify." This is from The Hungry Tide. Now, as you all know that hinterland is a German word that refers to the area behind which is inaccessible and somewhat unknown territory. The hinterland is represented cartographically as the quote-unquote back country, which is located behind the river shore or the sea, or refers to coastal area or a region that is far away from cities in the spatial arrangement. Right? Let me move on to the next slide. Now, this idea of hinterland cartographically alludes to an underdeveloped space, and culturally is usually considered as the lack of cities' rich cultural capital. This binary between up and down, near and far, front and back, not only emphasizes or establishes, I would argue, the physical positionality of the human subject or in any inmate object, but it also appropriates social interactions, produces comparative gradation of spaces, and imposes certain values on space and landscape. Surprisingly, the hinterland denotes both abundance and scarcity. Nonetheless, the notion of hinterland appears to be culturally and figuratively demarcated by the distinction between confined, bounded concept of city and the fuzzy hybrid concept of hinterland. As a result of such spatial conventionality and the detailed integration of cultural appropriations process, the demarcation between coherent urban and the integration of and the non-urban has been developed and put forward into the collective consciousness of people. So these antagonistic notions of center and periphery, on the other hand, could be observed mutually beneficial, sometimes complementary, as well as a part of continuum inside one single spatial dimension. So, uh, what is the reason behind putting such analysis here is to understand that before assess this concept of city, before assess this concept of any hinterland, uh, and here in our context, Sundarbans, should be understood not just a spatial or geographical discourse, but also from cultural ideological underpinning as well. Now, let's talk about what is so new about this spatial understanding. What is so new about this spatial term that we are going to discuss here? I mean, what would happen if we introduce this spatial theoretical perspective in the context of Sundarbans or in the context of the text hungry type? Now, developing this theoretical framework for understanding the concept of space seems to have become increasingly difficult nowadays because of this rapid transformation of the world, including the global flow of capital, information system, ecological disaster, and of course, migration to uh, just a few instances. Probably it was Foucault with whom this so-called spatial turn uh, in literary as well as geographical, cultural geographical studies have been introduced. So I'll start with a Foucault's quote. Uh, Foucault says, the great obsession of the 19th century was, as we know, history, with its themes of development and suspension, of crisis and cycle, themes of the ever accumulating past, with its great preponderance of dead man and the menacing glaciation of the world. The 19th century found its essential mythological resources in the second principle of thermodynamics. The present epoch will perhaps be above all the epoch of space. We are in the epoch of simultaneity. We are in the epoch of juxtaposition, the epoch of the near and far, of the side by side, of the dispersed. This is extremely important to understand our present context. Now, in his 1976 lecture of Other Spaces, Utopias and Heterotopias, Michel Foucault was perhaps the first social and cultural historian to undertake a critical discourse on spatial conceptualization. In this regard, we can also mention Martin Heidegger uh, before uh, uh, Michel Foucault, although Heideggerian perception of space uh, was rather phenomenological than cultural. Now, to explore more on Heideggerian concept of space, we can also mention his essay "Building, Dwelling, Thinking," right, which was published in 1954, and in that work, uh, he also probably uh, introduces or foreruns this so-called spatial discourse, but in a different way. Now, in that essay, Heidegger mentions that dwelling in a particular space is connected to our existence or being in the world. The way we live on the surface of the earth is a reflection of who we are. Thus, our lived experience becomes an extension of our thoughts and identity. Now, another phenomenologist, since we have introduced Martin Heidegger in very briefly, so we can also uh, consider another phenomenologist and French theoretician, Gaston Bachelard. Now, Bachelard views that the place in which we dwell is not a uniform and empty space, but rather a space that is densely imbued with values and perhaps also with a strong psychological essence. In his Poetics of Space, we could find various explanation of uh, interiority of space. I'm not going into that idea because that's a different idea. So, what sets Foucault apart from Heidegger and Bachelard probably is his emphasis on the concrete external space, indicating the 20th century spatial turn. Because uh, both Heidegger and Bachelard was talking about the interiority of the space, the house, the dwelling, our habitat. Now, Foucault, now focusing on the external part of space, introduce a new dimension to this spatial studies in 20th century, at the end of 20th century, after 1960s and so on. Uh, After Foucault, we can also mention another Marxist uh, theoretician and as well as cultural historian, Henri Lefebvre, or to be precise, Henri Lefebvre. And Lefebvre, in his production of space, develops his idea of social production of space. That is how space is constructed through the social relations among living bodies, quote unquote, living bodies. So this socio-spatial dialectic leads to cultural geography that evolved from traditional geography's original physical knowledge of space to a more metaphysical concept of the formation of social space. This is the point I want to arrive at, because this is the whole point of my discussion so far. So this new form of cultural geography could able to incorporate the neglected spaces of everyday practice, including the marginal cultural production, the reproduction of landscape, and so on. Moving on to the next slides. Now, if we understand uh, so far, I mean, how the coastal regions of Sundarbans and the idea of space or the theory of space can be observed together, we must now focus on how Ghosh's idea of uh, Sundarban that we can observe in the text. Now, the Sundarban, called as Bhati Desh, I mean, in the text, Hungry Tide, Amitabh Ghosh has called Sundarban as so-called Bhati Desh. And we can understand that this Bhati Desh is the land of rivers, floods, tigers, dolphin, and of course is located a considerable distance away from Kolkata, the capital of West Bengal, right? So this archipelago, which is known as Sundarban or the beautiful forest, uh, perhaps perhaps uh, becomes such for uh, for for the Sundari tree, or more scientifically, Heritaria minor tree, right? Now, it is a vast trace of forest and saltwater swamp forming the lower part of Ganges River Delta in the southeastern West Bengal state. And it also spread in other locations like the northeastern India as well as southern Bangladesh too. And the present story of Hungry Tide presents a topographical view of this vast archipelago of island, where the shapes of the land constantly alters with the ebb and flow of water, as well as the livelihood of individuals who inhabit there. As a corollary, the residents of the region have become accustomed to working in an unsteady and fluid spatial dimension. The Sundarban, with its distinct exotic natural landscape, has been extensively featured in Bengali literary tradition. However, the majority of this literary representation function as a reflection of their problematic Bengali Bhadralok Samaj and their ideology, and uh, views this vast region as quote unquote spatial other. Right now, let me talk about very briefly, since I have just introduced this so-called ideology of Bhadra Samaj, or gentle society. Uh, we must briefly also talk about this idea as well. Now, this ideology of Bhadra Samaj is the prevailing class ideology in Bengal that originated during the colonial era and has remained so until the present day. It continues to have an impact on the Bengali public sphere, helping to shape public opinion and political policies, among other things. It was this group of educated or English educated, cultured people, mostly living in urban areas, who once served as the antidote to Western modernism or Western modernity by upholding the idea of individuality as well as the Eastern spiritual superiority. Now, it is this Bengali intelligentsia, their concept of civil society, and the notion of individual ethics that define the distinct Bengali and its culture abroad. Now, anything that slips outside this Bhadralok or gentlemanly discourse, including the habit, customs, food practice, rituals, conduct, becomes derivative and a matter of inadequacy. I think in this context, Prathama Banerjee's book is extremely significant. Let me just quote very briefly from Banerjee. She said, in this paradigm, it is not absurd to say that the modern always comes after the non-modern, historically and logically, even though they may coexist empirically in and at the same time. With modernity, the world reappears in a strange and unprecedented way as an agglomeration of coexistence yet non-contemporary beings. So, what is my principal question then? I mean, if so far I've given a broad introduction to my topics, and then the question remains: what would be my primary thirst here in this lecture? Now, we all know that Amitabh Ghosh's writing are well known for his equivocal position, which undermines the grand narrative of episteme in which they have been placed. A multiple and polyphonic vision of the world is presented in The Hungry Tide by keeping Ghosh's decentered authorial stance. Notably, in the text, Sundarbans is depicted from the perspective of both outsiders and locals, which I suggest establish a dichotomy between the elite Bengali Bhadra Samaj and the rural Bengali folk, which is only to be disturbed and dismantled at the end. Thus, the present talk will examine how the landscape of Sundarbans has been represented in Ghosh's novel, The Hungry Tide, as a heterotopic space that combines the sense of belonging and unbelonging, as well as experiences of being at home and without a place to call home. Now, secondly, according to psychoanalytical theory, the hinterland suggests a realm, a stretch beyond perception, a repressed memory or trauma that may be physical or symbolic. So, in this context, it will be also, I think, interesting to see how the novel investigates this repressed history of refugee displacement at Morijhapi into its narrative structure. So these are the two broad questions that I want to explore here in my lecture. Now, see, these are the some instances. These are the few instances of vernacular literature on uh, Sundarbans, as well as uh, Anglophone literatures on Sundarbans. I mean, let me just briefly mention them. Dongri Chorit or of Tailokunath Mukhopadhyay, then Sundarbon Shat Bochor, Bibhitibhushan Bandyopadhyay, uh, and of course some of the English literature or Anglophone literature like Cy Montgomery's Spale of the Tiger, Forest of Tides, and so on. Now I'll talk about uh, this brief history of how Sundarban has been uh, represented in various vernacular and Anglophone literature so far, because that's how we can indicate what real transformation, what real changes that Amitabh Ghosh come with in the text of Hungry Tide. Now, there is an extensive corpus of indigenous vernacular and Anglophone literature based on Sundarban regions. In Puthi literature, I mean, the first, I mean, in the previous slide, the first picture was this Puthi literature, was of this Puthi literature. So, in Puthi literature, which is a kind of Bengali verse that was written during the 17th and 19th century, the gods and goddesses of lower delta region were glorified. Then there is the cult of Bonobibi, the presiding deity and forest protector, the snake goddess Manasa, as well as a number of other local deities who provide a psychological feeling of protection in such a violent and intimidating environment. Now, according to this Puthi literature, the life in the Sundarban is a cycle that is profoundly entwined with nature and religion. Now, later, because of such writers as Tailokunath Mukhopadhyay and his creation, Dongri Chorit, who wrote in the late 19th century, the region is transformed into a land of fantasy and adventure that probably an average middle class Bengali folk has always coveted. On the other hand, since the outset of land reclamation, the tale of myths and rituals have been transformed into a narrative of ecological degradation and conflict around man and animal. The text like uh, Atmokotha of Sundarban by Shiv Shankar Mitro or Manoj Basu's Bon Kete Boshat or Montgomery's Spale of the Tiger becomes so vital here in our context. Now, in the second place, probably yeah, in this kinds of work, uh, an agent of the modern world, whom one might ascribe as savior observer, who is not an associate of this antagonistic world, arrives at Sundarbans, becomes cognizant of their struggle, uh, of course, of the locals, and extend their helping hands with noble intention. Probably that's how the narrative structure been like in Bibhitibhushan Bandyopadhyay, Sundarbone Shat Bochor, or Monisha Shovarani's sort of memoir, Forest of Tide, the untold story of the Sundar. Now, the disclosure of people's fight and struggle was the central focus of this narrative, no doubt. Yet, their representation demonstrate that the stories often written from the middle class prism romanticize and mystified the new spirit of fighting. Fear was eventually replaced by the spirit of adventure. This appears to to be the predicament of Bengali Bhodro Samaj and their haunting sense of backwardness later on. So these narratives portray the Sundarbans as a region characterized by loss and struggle, a space that is perceived through the negation of its center. So probably this idea is very close what Frederick Jameson would refer to call a spatial analysis of culture. And he and for him, well, for Jameson, this cultural appropriation of spaces could be observed as, I'm quoting him, symptoms and expressions of a new and historically original dilemma, one that involves our insertion as individual subjects into multidimensional set of radically discontinuous reality. Now, the question is, if I placed my discourse like this, uh, as somehow pitted against the so-called uh, Bhodro Samaj and their gentlemanly discourse, then the question is that Amitabh Ghosh himself belongs to this descendant of Bhodro Samaj. So how his ideology uh, could be mm, uh, come into our consideration in the text, or should also consider. Now, uh, while Ghosh's non-fictional writings clarify that uh, the influence of Rabindranath Tagore and Satyajit Ray, the emblematic ambassadors of Bengali literary and cultural tradition, uh, and also associates with this Vodolok intelligentsia, has curated and helped him to uh, construct his creative imagination. As a result, the author's representative voice itself is called into doubt and should be subjected to further consideration. Now, Ghosh's work, on the other hand, are also interesting to see how this representational politics that he himself has understood and presented in a different way. Now, it is conceivable that his affiliation with the Subaltern Studies Project, as well as his drift toward marginalized people and remote regions, as he mentioned in an interview with Chitra Sankaran, might result in works that would serve as critique of this nation's prevailing Bhodrolok discourse. Ghosh mentions, I'm quoting Ghosh, I'm drawn to rural India, to marginal India. I'm drawn to marginal people in India, obscure figures, defeated figures, and people who salvage some sort of life out of wreckage. Unquote. Now, even after this, Ghosh was not, or Ghosh's position cannot be taken without further criticism. And that is probably why Makrand Paranjev has, in his essay called Beyond the Subaltern Syndrome, Amitabh Ghosh and the Crisis of Bhodro Samaj, has rightly pointed out that uh, even though Ghosh posits the crisis, he does not confront them steadfastly by not allowing them fully to develop or escaping into coincidence, or sometimes only producing doubling or romanticizing things. However, what I would argue that this ambivalent closure of his text, being credulous to subjugated knowledges, signifies the fissures of this exclusive signification process of Vodolok and national culture. Angshuman Mondal rightly points out in this context that Ghosh's ambivalence position refused to make a choice based on a binary model. He chooses rather both. The rhetoric of political activism, rather than keeping open the ethical negotiations of cultural differences, forecloses it by insisting on achieving ends at the expense of exploring the means. So this is how Ghosh has negotiated this uh, gentlemanly discourse uh, in his literary writings, and particularly uh, in the Hungry Tide. Now I'll talk about this question of belonging. Probably this is the uh, most significant part of my whole lecture, because uh, so far what I have mentioned theoretically or from the perspective of Ghosh's own individual ideology could be observed uh, in the Hungry Tide, and how this is will be disclosed further in my later discussion. Now that we must remember that the individual identity, in the sense of self-understanding, is thoroughly connected to notion of place. Place encompasses an actual yes an actual geographical place, but also social relations embedded into that specific place. And belonging to a certain place is then the personal, intimate feeling of being at home in a place. So, home is thought of as a symbolic space of familiarity, comfort, security, and emotional attachment. Now, although there is a social aspect with the concept of place belongingness in terms of families, friends, communities, societies, we imagine in relation to specific places, the concept puts emphasis on the individual relation with and also attachment to the place. So, the primacy of space within the formation of an individual's identity is attributed to the human subject's mode of being, which is always being in the world or being in the place, to be more precise. Thus, the self within this conceptualization is not seen in relation to other, but is rather rooted in surrounding local materiality in space. In the Hungry Tide, Ghosh weaves together themes of travel, ecology, cultural anthropology, as well as landscape in a singular, compelling way. Probably at the outset of the novel, two characters come to the tidal country for their own walk. In the story, Pia Leroy, or Pia, uh, a cetologist, begins research in Idawardi dolphins with Fokir, a local fisherman who is uneducated, and Kanaidat, a professional translator who returns to her aunt Nilima's house in Lusabari, a fictitious place in Sundarbans, and discloses his uncle's Nirmal diary, which contains information about the forgotten violent refugee history. I'll talk about these things later on. So it is interesting to see how the author has made way for those who prefer hinterlands and bohemias of their own instead of falling into trappings of settled fixities. Now, this idea would be further uh, 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 perceivable if we consider the characters one after another in the text. Now, the narrative of the Hungry Tide opens cautiously, as Ghosh understands that one separate, definite discourse on home life or any story about the issue of belongingness would fall short, particularly in the context of Sundarbans, owing to its moving nature of the environment, and so are the lives of the characters. It is like silt in a river that is constantly shifting here and there. So, regardless of whether the sea swallows the entire peninsula at times, life continues in its own manner. Ghosh himself narrates in the novel, I'm quoting him, there are no borders here to divide fresh water from salt, river from sea. The tides reach as far as they are 100 kilometers inland, and every 1,000 of acres of forest disappear underwater, only to re-emerge hours later. Unquote. Now, in the novel, Kanai works as an interpreter and translator. He comes from a language-centric culture where meaning is difficult to grasp. As he points out, he considered the translated universe to be his home because language has the ability to encapsulate the entirety of reality. He takes great satisfaction even in the fact that he knows 5 or 6 languages. He appears that his initial reluctance to travel to Lusibari, as well as his uneasiness in that sociocultural environment, which further indicates a fixity, as well as his inability to adapt to this fast changing and transforming nature of Sundarbans. Right? Now, at the end, when he finally returns to his house, Kanai expresses his frustration with language limitations and demonstrates that home for him has only been a comfortable, well organized space or habitat. So, Kanai somehow couldn't manage, even after having all those knowledges in languages and speciality in translating things, to understand the real nature, to understand the real crux of Sundarbans and their people, or even culture in broad. Nilima Bose, another character, and Mashima of Kanai, in contrast to Kanai, has a strong attachment to this unsettled location. Leaving Lusibari or relocating from a specific location feels like a betrayal to her, since she feels a strong connection to its people, a sense of social obligation towards them, and perhaps a sense of responsibility towards her late husband Nirmal's memory too. It is Nilima's spatial sense of belonging that shapes her actual experience, as well as her natural goals and dreams, even in the face of a hostile environment. Nirmal, her husband, on the other hand, feels like an intruder who believes in utopian revolution and in constantly on the lookout for a place to call home for Bangladeshi refugees. Akin to Rilke's Duno elegies, Nirmal is on the quest for an imaginary realm in history that will confront the historical and political realities of the present. His transgression, in opposition to Nilima's reinvented space of Lusibari, is also an alternative form of belonging. Because for him, home is where the revolutionaries are. With regard to this concept of home, Pia almost echoes Nilima's sentiment when she says, "For me, home is where Orsilas are," which is similar to Nilima's thoughts. Home is wherever I can brew a pot of gold tea, a pot of good tea. So Pia constantly redefines her sense of belonging with each new environment and does not trust in the permanence of language, which is similar to her ever shifting life and experiences. Another character that can be called into our context is Moina. Moina is Faki's wife and has a greater sense of belonging to Lusibari too. Now, her sense of belongingness is evident in her daily struggle. It is her entire home. It is here that she learns to conquer the hardship that life throws at her. But simultaneously, she also wishes to leave the location in order to have a better future and to be free of this banal constraint of her life. So, Moina's belongingness can be explained by her desire of abandonment. Home, in other words, is an unending quest, Nilima at the beginning of the end, and Moina of the end of the beginning, at the end of the beginning. So this is important to notice that it is not a straightforward binary or a kind of dilemma in which Ghosh has uh, presented the idea of belongingness or the non-belongingness in the context of Sundarbans in a hungry tide. Now, it is a question of both feeling home and not at home, pitted against each other, or even placing simultaneously of both. So, Ghosh does this purposively in order to eliminate the binary between these two ideas and to further discloses the intricacies of life, culture, and this region. So we can say that a living body produces space rather than being an absolute container that is merely waiting to be filled with a matter of bodies, which is the case in the novel. Now let's talk about the idea of language very briefly. Now, this is an important work, I think. This is written by Ulrich Lattmann, and the book is called Universe of the Mind, a Semiotic Theory of Culture. Now, in this book, he discusses the semiotic relationship between humans and the social environment, which he refers to call semiosphere. In other words, as he mentions, culture is the self-referential system in which semiotic spaces are embedded in more encompassing isomorphic spaces of cultural semiosis. So, by taking his idea of language, belongingness, and this geographical space, which mentioned as semiosphere, and how this semiosphere, where semiotics and space and culture are intertwined with each other, we can now observe, we can now explore this idea in Ghosh's Hungry Tide. Now, in the Hungry Tide, Amitav Ghosh expresses concern about communications between humans. In the novel, he juxtaposes language and silence to analyze how people communicate. This is very interesting to note, that he doesn't place only language as the sole medium of communication. Rather, he places again his ambivalence, ideological understanding of things. And that's why he is placing language as well as silence to understand this idea of communication, which is particularly important in the case of Sundarbans. Now, Piali and Fakir, two of the three main characters in the Hungry Tide, are both monolingual, right? While Kanai is a multilingual character. Aside from dialect, Kanai is a professional interpreter who speaks 6 languages and so on. And Piali only speaks English since she has refused to learn Bengali, even which it is her parents' native tongue. Fakir, on the other hand, is only communicable in the local dialect of the Tide country. He is endowed with a powerful and enchanting voice to sing the legendary song of Bono Bibi, but in regular social conversation, he remains rather silent in most of the text, most of the part of the text. Now, as if Fakir were a fictional character who wasn't very interested in interacting with people in the real world. Now, these 3 characters were developed by Ghosh to examine the potential and constraints of language in human communication. They each possess various linguistic skills. Monolingual, even though Piali travels to several nations, her linguistic limitation pose no issue for her. Despite Piali's sadness over her monolingualism, Ghosh demonstrates that language proficiency is not always a need for effective communication. Lucy Berry and Mashima were the only words Piali could manage to pronounce in the text while on the boat. But that were sufficient for her to communicate with Fokir and accomplish her goal. At the same time, Ghosh astounds us by demonstrating that linguistic proficiency or multilingualism are not necessarily important in order to comprehend a situation or have an effective communication. Multilingual Kanai, who believes that his ability to speak multiple languages give him complete communication capacity, finds it rather difficult to comprehend Moina's admission that he would not understand her motivation of marrying Fokis. So what Ghosh really shows in the novel, how writing in a different language can be possible, but because of a metonymic gaps, translating the full essence of a culture is not always possible. And to grab the full essence of a different culture, language must transform from a standardized version. To this end, Ghosh also transformed some of the English and native words in the Hungry Tides as well. He substitutes English words with native expression, sometimes even without giving any translation or even interpretation. Just like Bindi, Achol, Mohona, Chai, Puja, Gamcha, lots of many native words have been used in the text without any translation or interpretation. Now, Ghosh's use of this untranslated native expression reminds us of these metonymic gaps between two cultures. They are the vehicles used by Ghosh to present the localism to the international forum. And for the people of Sundarban, language is an integral part of their entrenched identity and also their particular geographical existence. As Pablo Mukherjee points out in this context, that it is precisely the limits of the elite Bhodro Samaj that prevents them from grasping the realities of the marginal people of the Sundarban. The Sundarban are thus exoticized, fantasized, and maintained as being a site of poverty and hardship in the majority of literary representation and the bourgeois gaze on them. But Ghosh's postmodern deconstructive approach to this internal acknowledges the region's singularity rather than attempting to study in its entirety. It is this structural disharmony, or in a way harmony and discord, that the two elements of the story, the ebb, bhata, and the flood, joar, represent simultaneously, where the underlying force of life is porous and fleeting. So this is once again the use of language shows the very ambivalence as well as the very understanding of belonging and unbelonging in the context of Hungry Tide. I've almost come at the end of my lecture. Now I'll briefly focus on the psychoanalytical interpretation of Sundarbans that can be assessed from the text as well. Although I'll not talk about this psychoanalytical terms and theories in depth because that needs a separate discussion. I just only want to point out 2 or 3 ideas that we can also put forward in this context. Now, Hinterland can be used as a metaphor for repression or traumatic memory or even forgotten past in terms of psychoanalytical perspective. The Sundarbans and its landscape can be considered as the post-colonial hinterland, which is being represented, visualized, and documented, yet remained unknown and unseen to the outside world. Despite the fact that their horrific past of forced refugee displacement has been written aside in the official top-down history of Bengal, still, their spectre continues to haunt the land. Now, this will be far more interesting if we introduce briefly the idea of uncanny. Now, we all know that uncanny, as Freud elaborates, is a kind of spatial perception along with, of course, the psychological dimension to it, which appears as something strangely familiar, something or some unfamiliar things appear strangely familiar. It is also the outer embodiment of our id, as Freud mentions, our repressed taboos, instinct, desire, among other things. In the book, The Location of Culture, Homike Bhabha extend this concept of uncanny beyond the realm of this psychosexual to include the repressive workings of the cultural unconsciousness. In other words, how the absence continues to haunt the presence and forces to reconsider the present narrative of history. Now, probably many of you are also aware of the idea of hauntology, because this idea of uncanny could also be extended into another idea called hauntology of Derrida, which I'm not actually uh, presenting here because that's also needs a separate discussion. These are the two instances, that was published in print media back in 1980s when this Morijjabi massacre uh, had took place. So, how can you observe this Morijjabi context, and what was this Morijjabi issue? If we briefly uh, briefly introduce this idea, this historical context, then uh, taking this strange environment as well as this repressed historical background, Ghosh in The Hungry Tide depicts the plight of refugees at Morijjabi who have been exiled to Dandakarna in central India under the guise of Project Tiger, preservation of natural environment. Now, the government in the text, I'm quoting from the text actually, uh, it is said that the government is going to take measures, very strong measures. All movement in and out of Morijjabi was banned under the provision from the Forest Preservation Act. Unquote. So, after the partition of India, some low caste Hindus fled from Bangladesh, attempted to relocate in the Sundarban region back in 1980s. However, the state government, which ironically happened to be the Marxist Party under the leadership of Jyoti Basu, declared their attempt to do so illegal. The open firing of the state-sponsored violence resulted in the deaths of 36 people. Shockingly, with the exception of few media articles and a backlash against the parliament, the Morijjabi slaughter has been kept out of the public consciousness for a long period. In Hungry Tide, Nirmal, a school teacher and a committed Marxist, appears shell-shocked to experience such violence and death of common armless people, while he himself was the practitioner of this ideology. In fact, he devoted his entire life to find a home for these exiled people, particularly for Kusum, his love interest in the novel. So, how the post-colonial nation, or post-colonial nation state to be precise, cures growth and development, which is exclusively envisioned from its Bhadraloki urban perspective is demonstrated through his personal experience and later in subsequent horrible death. However, this Morinjapi massacre, as recorded in Nemal's concealed diary, continues to haunt the modern civilized society of Kanai in an uncanny way. In other words, power over the past comes. Ghost Ghost seems to suggest through the dual modes of knowledges and understanding of what happened at Morichapi, or the return of the spectre of Morichapi, marks the arrival of haunting reminders of modernity's violence, of the sacrifices of Nirmal and countless others, and later, or the vision of Nimai. Now, coming to my final slide, and here is my brief conclusion, that the spatial analysis of culture indicates the dominant ideology put forward by the urban bourgeoisie. In their discursive practice, spatial backwardness is transformed into a cultural other, to the center, what I have called in this talk as spatial other. Since hinterland stands on the periphery of space, their history becomes a marginalized one, or becomes a monophonic discourse. Amitabh Ghosh's The Hungry Tide calls this representational politics into question and demonstrates how Sundarbans, with its harsh living conditions, can be a place of personal attachment too. It is at the conclusion of the novel that both visitors Pia and Kanai, who have promised to return again at Lucyberry, expresses their recognition of the feeling of belongingness that people always have, or the locals always have, for their place. So this powerful presence of Nirmal's diary, even after his death, shows that the history of hinterland, despite being marginalized, will continue to haunt the post-colonial Bengal and its elite Bauddha Samaj. Thank you.
Thank you, Animesh. I would now invite my colleague, Dr. Aparna Singh, to handle the question answer session.
Sure.
Yes, thank you, Madhumita Di, and thank you so much, Animesh, for that fascinating lecture and the way in which you kind of, very clearly pointed out the limitations of the binaries that we often get trapped in, the binary between language and silence, the binary between, the binary of rather the rural and the urban, the idea of belongingness and not belongingness. So I think that was a fascinating journey that we all enjoyed a lot, and the way in which you have kind of shown how the idea of spatial politics needs to be reassessed through a different lens. Madhumita Di, I haven't yet seen any questions on the YouTube link.
But then, if you have questions, then I think you can put it here, or any
Yes,
of my colleagues
I
here.
have already, yes. I just have one question. If I can begin with that question, Madhumita Di.
Yes, of course.
This is just one question. I was wondering if, why it just, occurred to me, why is it that Amitabha Ghosh does not give language to Fokir? Of course, the limitations of the language, and it is just merely an observation. I just correct me if I'm wrong. Is it because, Ghosh was putting that scanner, or he was putting himself under the scanner, or turning that scrutinizing lens towards himself and saying that, see, I cannot ever talk or stand in for Fokir. The way in which the criticism of subaltern theory was basically trying to point out that the intellectual or the Bhadralok probably will never be able to speak or stand in for the subaltern. So if
Right.
you could just comment on that.
Yes, I think Aparna, your observation is absolutely bang on, because uh, that's why I have started my discussion too. Because uh, Ghosh, in his non-fictional writings, has repeatedly mentioned about his influences. Probably there is a essay that, called "My uh, Grandfather's Book." Is probably that is the name of the essay, where he has mentioned about his influences. Uh, of Rabindranath, Satyajit Ray, and then Amartya Sen as well. And he was acutely aware of his own Bhadralok position as well. And probably this is why uh, he has presented Fakir in a different way, because uh, you know representing a subaltern figure, representing a marginal figure, uh, and giving his voice also calls into another representational politics and question and so on. And that's why probably Ghosh has rather put a kind of indifferent attitude to Fakir, and uh, presented the character who is himself engaged in songs and other kinds of things, because that silence itself calls how uh, we who are so-called the representative of these urban folks couldn't really grasp uh, the real crux of the Sundarban society and its people and life and culture.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Animesh. We have a question by Kollani Shashmol, who is a second year PG student. She asks, Sir, can we say that the folk culture or the Sundarban culture is somehow suppressed under the so called Bhadra Samaj of Bengal? Isn't a cultural mummification within the same Bengali culture?
Yes, thank you for the question, Kulani. I mean, this is what I have tried to explain in my lecture, because what happened, uh, I mean, I have given a brief historiographical analysis of how Sundarban has been presented and represented over the decades, starting from 17th century, then right down to the 19th century, and so on. And probably in all those literature, you could see how the culture and the people of Sundarban has been presented only from the gaze of Bhadralok people, right? So this is why the culture itself demands for a new paradigm. Right? It should be presented. It should be understood from its own respect, not from the position of, as quote unquote, lack of the other. Right? And this is what I have tried to point out in case of Hungry Tide, and how Ghosh has understood this politics and tried to introduce this representational dynamics in the novel.
Uh, Thank you, Unimesh. The next question is from Shunanda Tiwari. She's also a PG second year student. She asks, regarding the legend of Bone Baby, can you please reflect on the cultural and religious practices in Sundarban, which mingle both Hindu and Muslim religious values, which are becoming rare to see?
Right. Uh, Let me start with the very idea of postmodernism, because although we sometimes call Amitabh Ghosh as the post-colonial author, but if we read his novels and writings intensively, then we cannot really classify classify Amitabh Ghosh as post-colonial, because his novels and writings are very degeneric in that way. Uh, so uh, what is the basic idea of postmodernism, or what was the basic idea that post-colonialism introduces, is this critique of enlightenment project, and how you can always read or interpret the idea of myth, tells mystery along with science, right? Because those enlightenment project uh, has made us understood that if something cannot be understood from the perspective of science, then it cannot be taken seriously. So, what really brings such this literary theory, postmodernism and postcolonialism, into our context is to reading both ideas together, right? So, This is why the legend of Banbibi, the legend of other folklores and myths and tales are always already significant in the context of any any knowledges about the local people, any knowledges about the local society in our context of Sundarban too. And probably this is the reason Amitabh Ghosh has not provided or has not tried to explain the legend of Banbibi in a scientific manner, because that should be there in their own way. This is how we can respect, and this is how we can really understand, or we can really understand or perceive the actual Sundarbans culture. And
Thank
also, of
you.
course, these things are uh, rarely presented in other types of literature. But nowadays, I think uh, these ideas are also getting lots of challenges, and new kinds of discourses are emerging out too.
Right, right. Thank you so much, Onimesh. Do we have uh, I can't see any more
Said.
questions, Madhumita
Yeah,
ji.
the last question that we have from Shunanda, I think more or less is something that he has already answered.
Yes,
Oh
yes,
yes,
sir.
we have another question. Yes, yes, he's already covered this area. But I'll just read out this question. Sir, can we say that Ghosh is trying to renew the lost local culture of Sundarban and trying to reawaken us about
Yes,
ecological crisis through his novels?
absolutely, absolutely.
So, so I think we can end the question answer session, Madhumita ji, and I
Yes,
would now,
yes, yes,
yes, I would now
yes. I
request Professor Madhumita Mojumdar, please deliver the vote of thanks, and thank you, Onimesh, once again for this
Thank you,
absolutely
Aparna.
wonderful lecture. Yes, thank you.
Uh, thank you, Aparna. And for the vote of thanks, of course, I would begin by thanking our Vice Chancellor, Professor Kajol De, who is always, encouraging us to conduct such lectures, or to, have these academic sessions where, of course, our students are the one who are expectedly benefiting from it. And, the enthusiasm of the second year students of PG inevitably proves that this was a very successful lecture. So thank you, Onimesh. Recently we did have a lecture, on Hungry Tide. I think this is the beauty of such lectures. The other, academician that we had, who spoke on Sundarban, was talking about the idea of, isolation, home, and the binaries of home, and you have brought out the ecological crisis. You've brought out also the political contexts, of what it means to have a border and a non-border, and spaces, which are like, geographically fluid, the water, which perhaps makes it livable, non-livable, and how, in spite of the fact that, Sundarban remains a place which does not really boast of tribal people. So it's not that, people have been living there for long, and it's that people have migrated to that space. So even then, that, when you raise this question of belonging, and I think, especially the language, of silences, and the different kind of dialectical traces, which are very important, which talks about the cultural heteroglossia that this particular space called Sundarban has. It is ferocious. It is difficult to live, yet it is home, and, and you keep on coming back to it. So this, I think, is an important thing, and especially, when you are studying this particular text, Ghosh, I think, who is himself a researcher of this particular land. So therefore, this idea of re-researching what the researcher has said is actually what classroom teaching is all about. We keep on exploring, exploring the narratives of what the authors have said. So this is, I think, another perspective of this particular text that you have given to us. And thank you, Animesh, for that wonderful lecture and for this insightful insight that you have given us of this particular novel. I would also like to thank my colleagues in the department. I would begin with Dr. Aparajita Hajra. She's very much part of the department, but also the Dean Faculty of Arts and the acting registrar now. So therefore, she has always been a pillar of support in the department. I would take this opportunity also to thank Dr. Aparna Singh, Dr. Habib Suban, Kumar Aditya Sharkar, Dr. Malashri Mondol, and Dr. Indrila Ghosh. Indrila is on a fellowship, so she couldn't make it here today. So all of us together, work as a team, and of course, this is what keeps us going. And of course, my dear students who make this efforts worthwhile. So thank you once again. Hope to see you sometime in the off scale, mode someday. So thank you so much.